To our webinar, All About Audiobooks. So this is an updated webinar of the 2018 webinar that was titled the same, All About Audiobooks. It's been updated. So if you have listened to the All About Audiobooks webinar on our archived webinars, there's some that's going to sound similar, but it's been updated with new survey links and new suggestions and that kind of thing. So my name is Sarah Patterson. I am the Continuing Education Consultant for the Kentucky Department for Libraries and Archives. We are sponsored in part by IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services. We are happy that you are here today with us, and hopefully we'll all learn some new things, have some great discussion. Our training specialist, Tricia McCallum, is also here with us today, and she is happy to answer any questions or concerns that you might have. Just go ahead and stick them in the chat, and we will take a look at them, and that will be great. All right, before I start, I do want to say that there are some available resources in the course module shell for all of you, including any citations or surveys. They're all on a resource guide that's available for download in the course shell. You can go ahead and download that. It's a PDF with live links, so you can access any of the studies that I talk about. And then also one of the main surveys that we use for this presentation for the data is the Library Journal and School Library Journal Audiobook Survey of 2023, which I have made available for you also as a PDF in the course shell. You can go ahead and download that and then take a look at all of the data on your own a little bit later. Okay, so let's see what we're going to talk about today. So first, we're going to have an introduction to audiobooks, just in case you're not familiar with them. We'll get you caught up. Then we're going to look at some of the benefits of audiobooks. We'll look at some different audiobook platforms and apps that you can use for yourself or your patrons. And then we're going to discuss collection development and management of your audiobooks. Next, we're going to look at reader's advisory and helping your patrons choose the right audiobook for them. We'll talk about audiobook myths and misconceptions. We're going to look at marketing and promotion. And then again, we'll end with some resources and recommendations. And all of those resources and recommendations will be listed with live links as a PDF for you to download. So part one, introduction to audiobooks. So audiobooks are fantastic. I don't know how many of you listen to them. But what are audiobooks? So we should first discuss how we define audiobooks. Since the word audiobook wasn't really used until the mid-1990s, before that they were often called talking books or later books on tape. And I'm sure some of you in the audience remember books on tape and the huge format those used to come in with the 15 or 20 cassettes that would be inside. The audiobooks themselves are just narrated recordings of written works, and this includes both fiction and nonfiction. They are delivered now in a variety of digital and physical formats, and listeners can enjoy them as downloadable files using streaming platforms like Audible or Scribd, Apple Books, Storytel, Libby, Hoopla, and CDs. So you can access audiobooks on your smartphone, your tablet, your computer, smart speakers like Alexa, and audiobooks offer flexible on-demand listening that fits into virtually anybody's routine. So you might have patrons coming to you with all kinds of ways that they'd like to listen to audiobooks, and it's good for librarians to be up to date on pretty much all of those. So the audiobook timeline, this is one of my favorite parts of librarianship, which is the history of pretty much anything. But the history of audiobooks is very extensive. And I do realize the type on this slide is really small. The PDF of this presentation is available in the course files to download. So if you'd like, you can download the PDF and you can make it big, or you can zoom in digitally. You can print it out and hang it on your wall, whatever you'd like to do. But I do realize this is really little. So audio recordings of texts have been around for almost a century. As early as 1877, Thomas Edison saw the phonograph as a device for reading books out loud to people. And his first recording, which was Mary Had a Little Lamb, can be seen as the beginning children's read-along. It's interesting he chose that. Initially, the first attempts at making audio versions of books was focused pretty much on esteemed adult literature, highbrow literature just for grown-ups. But due to technological constraints in the early 20th century, literature was often read out loud on the radio instead of being recorded. And it was, again, mostly just for adult works. So in 1931, the Pratt-Smoot Act allowed federal funding to be used for recording books for the blind. But audio production in the US after that act really kind of took off. It took almost 35 years for publishers to really recognize that this was a part of the market that they could take advantage of. And in 1952, Caedmon Records made history actually by releasing the first recording of poet Dylan Thomas reading his own work. And that is what I would consider the first modern audiobook. No shade to Thomas Edison and Mary Had a Little Lamb, but Dylan Thomas reading his own work really established the audiobook business as a real business that was dedicated just to spoken word recordings. So in that same year, in 1952, Congress actually expanded the National Library Service for the Blind and Handicapped to include children. I don't know why it took that long to include children, but there we are. And then the next year, Mort Schindel founded Weston Woods, which was a company focused on translating the best in children's picture book literature into audiovisual media. So it was in the 1950s that people really started thinking, wow, we could really do something with this. And then soon after Weston Woods was founded, Anthony and Helen Ditlow launched Listening Library, which is still around today. I'm sure many of you have heard of Listening Library. And Listening Library was dedicated to producing unabridged recordings of children's and young adult literature for schools and libraries, which is pretty cool. In the 1970s and 80s, audiobooks began to explode in popularity because we had portable cassette players, if any of you remember those. And then in the 1970s, we actually started using the term audiobook, and that's because the audio cassette really took off around that time. In 1994, the audio cassette became the industry standard, and Random House Audio started producing its own audiobooks. The Audio Publishers Association was formed in '87, which is fantastic, and '87 was also the same year that Caedmon Audio was purchased by HarperCollins, which is still around, and Harper Audio, which is still around, was born. So that's great. 1987 also saw publishers Simon & Schuster, Hachette, and Macmillan all start their own audiobook lines. So the 80s was a fantastic time to be an audiobook. In the 1990s, we saw cassettes being replaced by CDs. I remember my first CD. You might remember your first CD. And the CD improved sound quality drastically, which is fantastic because it started all new audiobooks being published, and major publishers began producing unabridged versions of bestsellers. A lot of the 1990s CDs are still found in our libraries today. You probably have tons in your collection. In 1995, Audible was founded, which absolutely revolutionized the audiobook industry. Audible was actually bought by Amazon in 1998, which was 4 years after Amazon was founded. A lot of you might not remember this, but Amazon started as a book company, and then when they bought Audible in 1998, that really boosted Amazon's publishing sales. So at the turn of the millennium, we saw a massive digital shift. Technology has moved past CDs, and we now have the rise of the smartphone, and MP3 player audiobooks have just skyrocketed and are fantastic for people on the go, especially now as vehicles are no longer being made with CD players. In 2003, Overdrive started offering digital lending services to libraries. It started partnering first with the Cleveland Library to launch the first popular ebook and e-audiobook lending platform. So thank you, Cleveland Public Library System. The audiobook market is just growing and growing, and now we have audiobooks that we're looking to that are AI driven and have choose your own adventure formats, that adapt to listener preferences in real time. So that's pretty neat. We should look forward to seeing those coming out. And also, we now have seamless integration with smart speakers like the Alexa. We have subscription bundles, which, you might feel one way or the other about those. And then we have new languages being offered on streaming services with audiobooks, where previously we might not have had that before with CDs or cassettes, just because producing that physical media in different languages was so cost prohibitive. So a great little history on audiobooks starts all the way back with Thomas Edison. All right, so why do audiobooks matter? 4 reasons that we're going to talk about here. 1, accessibility. 2, convenience. 3, we have a huge market growth for them. And 4, engagement. So audiobooks have transformed how we access and enjoy books. They break down reading barriers. They fit seamlessly into our busy lives, our patrons' busy lives. Their narration makes literature and learning accessible to visually impaired listeners and those with reading disabilities or difficulties, both children, youth, and adults. We can now listen to audiobooks in our smartphones, in our cars. We can listen to audiobooks making dinner, during workouts. So it turns these idle moments that we have during the day into opportunities to read, where our patrons might not necessarily have the opportunity to sit down with a physical book. They might be able to play an audiobook instead. So audiobooks in general make reading more accessible for people, and they can improve reading comprehension and vocabulary and retention, especially when we pair them with the physical book, which is something we'll talk about a little bit later. So audiobook production. When we select audiobooks to produce, when we select physical books to produce in audiobook format, publishers look at several key factors before they will turn a physical book into an audiobook. So they need to consider the popularity and the past successes of the author in question, as that will predict strong audiobook sales. Equally important are the qualities of the text itself, such as whether it includes a distinct character voice that will lend itself well to spoken narration. Unfortunately, this means a lot of graphic novels don't get turned into audiobooks. The publishers also need to look at whether the structure of the writing will allow for a flexible and engaging listening experience. Books that are fast-paced, exciting, suspenseful, those tend to translate really well to audio. So you're going to see a lot of James Pattersons, right, being turned into audiobooks. But transferring a book to audiobook format can also bring out a lot of weaknesses in the original text. So what might pass unnoticed on the page, like awkward dialogue, flat pacing, confusing structure, will sometimes become more apparent when read out loud, which is something you'll want to take into consideration for Reader's Advisory. Producers also can face specific challenges that's unique to the audio medium. Transitions between time periods or locations can be really difficult to convey without visual cues. Extraneous elements like maps or illustrations or footnotes, they really have to adapt those creatively to maintain clarity in the author's intent, or the book can really become kind of a slog. Publishers also need to look at releasing the audiobook simultaneously with the print edition to maximize impact and market reach. So interestingly, audiobooks usually don't diverge dramatically in popularity from their print counterpart. Titles that sell well in print will usually sell well also in audio, which is great. But titles that struggle in print will sometimes struggle as audiobooks unless you can get a popular or really good narrator to do that audiobook. Speaking of narrators, audiobook narrators. So audiobook narration is a unique and specialized craft. It's so unique and special, there are even their own awards for narrators, which is great, and we'll talk about the awards in a bit. But narrators have to strike a careful balance. They have to bring life and emotion to the text without overshadowing the meaning of the text. They need to ensure proper pronunciation of the words in the story that reflect the context of the book, and how they interpret the book vocally needs to support the story rather than distract from it. So One critical factor in narration is aligning the narrator's voice with the age and tone of the characters. So this is really important in children's audiobooks, where you need to select a narrator that sounds age appropriate, um, and that can be a challenge. So in some cases, you'll find that producers will hire children or teens to narrate audiobooks in order to authentically capture the sound that the author was going for. And then the narrator's choices regarding tone and pitch and emphasis are really important. They can either captivate the listener or they can disengage the listener. And you'll find some of your patrons say, "Oh, this narrator has a terribly nasal voice. I can't really listen to this book." So very important. And then pacing is another vital aspect of narration. Pauses and tempos when a narrator is reading really can take away or add to an audiobook. And then the flow of narration needs to match the rhythm of the text. Otherwise, the listener stops being immersed. And sometimes audiobooks are narrated by the authors themselves. So while authors may not read like trained actors, they offer distinct authenticity to their books, and they recapture the emotions they felt while they were writing the book. So if you can get an audiobook narrated by the author, a lot of times it's really worth giving a listen to that audiobook, even if it's not a book you may have been interested in, because sometimes just the author reading the book is enough to really convey the intent of the text where a third-party reader might not be able to. So we have different narration styles, and this will be important during reader's advisory because oftentimes your patrons will have, they'll know exactly what they want. So there are several distinct styles of audiobook narration, and lots of listeners have lots of opinions on the types of narration that they're listening to. So the most common approach is fully voiced narration. So the narrator, one narrator, will use a different vocal delivery for each character. This technique will bring the story vividly to life, and it works really well in books where characters have distinct personalities or speech patterns or emotional tones, or maybe they're completely different characters in age or social demographic or anything like that. So in contrast, we have partially voiced narration, which emphasizes one or a few central characters with unique vocal styles, while the rest of the characters are read with a subtle variation. And this method will keep listeners engaged, but it also keeps the focus on the primary voice or voices within the narrative. And these are really, partially voiced is really good for when you have lots of characters, but one point of view. So, for example, War and Peace, looking at you, I think there's like a million characters that are introduced right at the beginning of the story. There's only a few that you really want to shine, so a partially voiced narration for that would be good. So a more theatrical approach is multi-voice narration, also called full cast. This is my personal favorite type of narration, and they're a little bit harder to find because rather than one narrator, you have a whole cast of narrators where you have, so this style, we use this style for dramatized audiobooks or complex narratives when you have multiple points of view, lots of characters, and it's almost like listening to a radio drama as opposed to an audiobook. Sometimes there'll be music, sound effects, that kind of thing. So then the last one we have is the unvoiced reading. And this is where the narrator maintains a consistent, almost monotone tone throughout the entire audiobook with almost no vocal changes to differentiate characters. And this approach is really good for nonfiction works or literary texts, or genres where the narrative voice is more important than the character interaction, so maybe poetry. So each narration style that we talked about here, serves a purpose for the book and the characters and the style of the book, but your patrons are going to have very specific ideas about what they like. So knowing these different narration styles are important so that when you talk with your patrons, you can say, would you prefer full cast, or would you rather have one voice do all of the characters really well? For example, Jim Dale, that kind of thing. So it's always good to know the different styles. So then we have different sound elements. So many audiobooks today include music and other sound elements that are supposed to enhance the listening experience. There's background music that, when used correctly, it can elevate the emotional tone and pacing of the story. When used incorrectly, it can really just take away from the audiobook, or sometimes the background music will go under the narrator, and that can be very distracting or confusing. But when used correctly, it can really help intensify the mood of a dramatic scene, or it can make fast-paced action more urgent. So beyond creating atmosphere, music inside of an audiobook often serves a practical storytelling function. So you might hear music when you're signaling transitions between chapters, when you're trying to shift the time and location without having any visual cues. Music can help designate changes in the storyline, and it can help the listener get through the structure of the audiobook. So complex narratives especially sometimes need sound elements, and it in general just makes the listening experience more immersive and engaging when used correctly. Your patron might come to you and say, there is so much music, it's so loud, I can't understand what's being said. So that might not be a great use of sound elements, but in general, sound elements are supposed to enhance the story. All right, so let's talk about some myths and conceptions. We'll just change tracks here. So I'm sure many of you have heard, audiobook isn't really reading. I can't listen to an audiobook and have it count for reading. We still have some libraries who refuse to count audiobook minutes for summer reading. So that's a huge myth surrounding audiobooks. So research shows that comprehension and retention can be comparable to reading print, especially when listeners are actively engaged, and comprehension and retention skyrockets when you have the physical book and the audiobook at the same time. So if you have a struggling reader in school who is having a hard time, or an adult who has a hard time focusing on the print itself, if you can find the audiobook and the print book, that would be really fantastic for them. So a 2021 blog post from the Teaching Channel cites a University of Missouri study that shows that audiobooks actually boost vocabulary exposure and working memory and comprehension, especially for struggling readers, because it allows learners to not only hear the new words in context, but it also lets them follow along with the text, and it engages multiple senses. So some assume audiobooks are only for children, right? Or people with visual impairments or reluctant readers. So one of the myths that we have on the screen is that audiobooks are only for people with disabilities or children, and that's not true. That overlooks how audiobooks can benefit our busy professionals, our new English language learners, or our literature enthusiasts in general. So others worry that audiobooks aren't for them, and that's a myth that we really need to kind of squash if we're going to be promoting audiobooks in general at our library. So a frequent concern for our third myth is that audiobooks are too expensive, which is crazy to me because everything at the library is free, right? But in general, people think that they can't listen to audiobooks, or they don't want to get involved in audiobooks because it might be too expensive. But with the rise of library apps like Libby and Hoopla, and then our free public domain titles, access to audiobooks now is actually more affordable and widespread than ever before. Thanks to streaming services, we have very affordable audiobooks on CDs. We can find these if your patrons want to actually buy them, we can find them at thrift stores. Very often friends of the library sales, especially as streaming services, get more popular. And then our patrons only need to have CD players. And if they don't have a CD player, and you have a huge collection of CDs in your library, allowing patrons to take out CD players with their CDs is a good way to make sure that your CD audiobooks are still circulating also. That way there's no cost barrier at all to audiobooks for our patrons. All right, so let's move on into collection development and management. So collection development for audiobooks is going to involve selecting titles that, just like regular books, that meets the interests and needs of your specific audience, meaning the community that you live in. So whether it's a library, whether you're taking outreach to schools, whether you're looking at your digital platforms and wondering what to buy, just like regular books, you're going to always want to try and meet the interests and needs of your community. So first, what we're going to do is we are going to look at some of our school library journal and library journal audiobook survey data to see what others are already doing. So as a reminder, this survey, which we're going to look at extensively, this survey is available as a PDF for you to download. You can look through it yourself. I did change the colors, so don't be surprised if the colors look a little different from the paper survey. So the School Library Journal found that in recent years, digital audio has become the dominant format for both adult and youth audiobook lending in public libraries. While physical audiobooks do continue to circulate, it's in decline, and many libraries, while still planning to maintain their collection of CDs, rely more on streaming services like Libby and Hoopla, that kind of thing. So really, though, we need a hybrid approach in order to continue our commitment to accessibility and format diversity for our patrons. So audiobooks currently make up around 10% of most public library materials budgets. Spending is shifting from physical to digital formats, but the impact of these budget decisions, it really varies depending on the size of the library, like all budget decisions, right? So larger libraries that serve huge populations are often more likely to increase their investment in audiobooks, while smaller libraries are either maintaining or reducing their spending, depending on local demand and funding. Audiobook selection. So when it comes to selecting audiobooks for the collection, librarians rely heavily on patron requests and professional audiobook reviews. It takes so much longer sometimes to listen to an audiobook. So being able to rely on what patrons request and, professional reviewers is very helpful. Other factors include the popularity of the print edition and the author's track record. So if a very popular print book is coming out, you're almost guaranteed to see it come out as an audiobook at the same time or soon after. Looking at you, James Patterson. So this user-centered approach really helps libraries stay responsive to their community interests, but also ensures the quality of their audiobook offerings. But from the patron's perspective, the title and author are the most influential factor in choosing an audiobook, which is fascinating to me because the author often isn't reading their own book. But according to this survey, our patrons are looking mostly at the title and author for audiobooks that they want to listen to. And the availability actually plays a more important role for younger listeners. So if an audiobook is on the shelf, a younger listener is more likely to take it as opposed to caring who the author is. So if it's available, I guess they will come. Libraries are also recognizing that narration quality really affects listener satisfaction and completion rates. And the completion rate is whether the listener finishes the audiobook. So a skilled narrator is going to make a huge difference between an engaging experience and a book that the listener isn't going to finish. And we have some extremely popular narrators that our patrons are going to listen to no matter what they put out, right? So that's interesting. So when selecting titles for audiobook collections, it's important to recognize that not all of your books are going to translate well into audio format, which really is unfortunate. So you'll see, so this is the slide data that shows how we're selecting our audiobooks. So you'll see that we're selecting children's books based on if they're an award winner, based on reviews, not so much based on the narrator. So that's interesting. So youth and audiobooks. So the School Library Journal and Library Journal did this survey in joint, but then the School Library Journal pulled out a lot of the information that pertained especially to youth and put out their own survey. So there are two surveys floating out there, but the one from the School Library Journal is focused heavily on children's and YA audiobooks circulation, which makes sense, right? It's the School Library Journal. So we are finding that children are engaging with audiobooks at increasingly younger ages, and libraries are responding to that. They found that 93% of public libraries now offer children's audiobooks, and 83% carry titles specifically for teens or young adults. So this strong presence of youth-oriented audiobooks in library collections is reflecting the rising demand and the importance of audio as an access point for literacy. We can listen to things before we can read them as children, and it's a fantastic entry into literacy and reading for the youngest of our patrons. So libraries are aligning their purchasing accordingly, and this study found that roughly 90% of their youth audiobook budget is devoted to fiction, where 11% is nonfiction. So fiction is king, right? And then audiobooks now make up almost 10% of total youth circulation, which has grown from the last time this study was done in 2018. But as technology changes, so do the library formats that libraries are offering. So CDs were once standard, and I'm sure your library right now has tons of audiobook CDs. But now libraries are turning to formats like playaways, which, if you don't know what those are, they're like little boxes that patrons can connect headphones to, and the whole audiobook is stored on this little box. It's pretty cool. Wonderbooks and Voxbooks to meet current listening habits. And it's a practical shift, right? Because most homes and vehicles don't have CD players anymore. We have a CD player in our kitchen that I protect zealously because I'm not sure if we'd ever even be able to replace it. So we need to look at different formats beyond CDs while still maintaining CDs for our patrons that still use those. Over 10% of libraries plan to phase out their physical audiobook collections for youth in the near future, which is really highlighting a significant trend toward digital access. So one interesting insight is that many children start listening to audiobooks long before they're confident readers, and they use audio as a bridge to higher literacy. And for some, audiobooks become their primary connection to the library resources. The Library Journal found that 12% of youth only borrow audiobook titles and no other materials, which is fascinating. So it's not only a gateway to literacy for children, sometimes audiobooks are the standalone resource for engagement between children and your library. All right, so this is another slide that shows how children are increasingly engaging with audiobooks at younger ages, how fiction is the dominant choice among listeners. And you could see here that fiction between adults and children is close, but there are more adult fiction, nonfiction being engaged with for adults, which, I mean, it makes sense, right? So, oh, and then also I will say that Library Journal found that the circulation of audiobooks mirrors the spending habits of the libraries, right? So in adult collections, fiction titles are about 80% of the circulation and 80% of the spending. Same for nonfiction. And then in the children's department, we find that 90% fiction circulates, whereas 10% nonfiction circulates. But I would like to see more nonfiction audiobooks. Those don't tend to translate as well to audiobook format for children just because they're so graphic heavy, but maybe in the future. All right, so here's a donut graph that shows back to adults, the adult fiction audiobook preferences. So mysteries, general fiction, and thrillers are the three most popular adult fiction genres, which is not surprising at all. Ranking only the #1 selection puts them in a slightly different order. We have general fiction, then mysteries, and then thrillers and suspenses. But overall, mysteries, general fiction, and thrillers and suspenses are going to be our adult listeners' top 3 preferences. So if you are a librarian who is just now getting into audiobooks and you're not quite sure what to focus on for Reader's Advisory, I would suggest one of those 3. Here we have nonfiction audiobook preferences. Biographies is standalone top right there. So if you look at the full study, you'll see that 88% of responders put biographies in their top 3, and 64% named it as their #1 subject. So, but overall, biographies and history and self-help were our top 3 nonfiction audiobook preferences, which kind of surprised me. I really thought that languages would be in the top 3, but that was put in under other categories, and self-help still beat it out. All right, so let's look at some awesome audiobooks. These are our audiobook awards. So not only do published books, so print books, get awards, audiobooks can win their own awards, which is great. There are several prestigious awards that recognize excellence in audiobook production and narration. The Audi Awards is presented by the Audio Publishers Association, which also, fun fact, sponsored that school library journal publication study. So thank you, Audio Publishers Association. The Audi Awards are the premier recognition of excellence in the audiobook industry. They are considered the Oscars of audiobooks. So if you see one of these right here, if you see one of these on an audiobook, it's going to be an awesome book, says them, right? So obviously everyone's going to have their own opinion, but that's going to be supposedly a great award. Let me get back to that. One moment. I circled my audiobook award and then it went all goofy on me. Okay, there we go. All right, so in 1996, the Audi Awards were established. They are outstanding narration and production and storytelling across all kinds of categories like fiction, nonfiction, mystery, fantasy, children's, young adults. So if it has an Audi Award on it, it's probably going to be pretty good. Then we have the Odyssey Award. It's presented by ALA's youth divisions. It came about in 2008, and it specifically recognizes the best audiobook produced for children or young adults in English and available in the United States. It celebrates high quality production and engaging narration that will appeal especially to our younger audiences. So if you're looking for a good audiobook for a younger patron and you don't know what's good or not, just see if you can find one that has the Odyssey Award on the cover. The Grammys for Best Audiobook Narration and Storytelling Recordings is given by the Recording Academy, and it includes spoken word performances like poetry readings and storytelling. And the word audiobook was added to that in 2006, even though the audiobook category has been around since 1959. It includes many celebrity narrated works and memoirs and children's and young adult audiobooks. But children's and young adult audiobooks are very rarely recognized in the Grammy Award for Best Audiobook. So they are geared toward adults. And then the Audiophile Earphones Award, presented by Audiophile Magazine, recognizes exceptional individual audiobook performances throughout the entire year. And those awards are based on excellence in narration, character portrayals, pacing, and how well the audio enhances the written text. So winning titles get the Earphone Award. Earphone Awards seal as a mark of distinction. So review sources, if you're forming your collection, you're not sure where to start looking, you can look at reviews. And audiobook reviews differ in a couple ways from traditional print book reviews. Print book reviews will usually emphasize the quality of the writing and the plot and the literary style, but audiobooks often will place a stronger focus on the narration and production elements. So the narrator's voice, the pacing, the emotional delivery, and the overall sound quality are more critical for audiobook reviews. And even though it's important for reviewers to assess the production quality when recommending audiobooks, it is worth noting that many listeners will prioritize the content itself over narration. So we find our patrons trying to balance the focus between the storytelling and the technical execution, right, to get the best experience. So here we have 5 audiobook review sources. So we have Audiophile Magazine, which is a bi-monthly publication that will review audiobooks and awards the best titles and narrators with the Earphones Award. We have Booklist, which is a monthly publication that provides reviews for books, audiobooks, and audiovisual materials for both public and school libraries. We have the School Library Journal and Library Journal, which are monthly publications targeted to public and school libraries. There's interviews and articles, and then they also have regular book reviews and audiobook reviews inside. The New York Times is always a good place to look for reviews. They publish a monthly list of the top best-selling fiction and nonfiction audiobook titles. So the New York Times review might not necessarily be fantastic audiobook sound, but it's what's selling. So that's a good place to look and see what's popular when you're trying to work on your collection. And then Publishers Weekly is a weekly publication which has news and reviews and articles for librarians, and it includes sometimes audiobooks. So you have tons of audiobooks now and you're not sure what to do with them, including all of your CDs. So let's talk about weeding, also known as deselection. Whoops. All right, so weeding. So weeding audiobooks is a lot like weeding a print collection. You're going to rely on core factors like condition, how it's being used, if it's being used, and alignment with your library's goals, which should align with your community goals. However, there are several special considerations to keep in mind that are just for audiobooks. So space. If you have limited space, which is a common issue in physical media, circulation should become your primary weeding criteria. So start by setting a cutoff date for the last circulation. A lot of times 2 years is a reasonable benchmark for most media. And then also think about your audience. So for example, while audiobooks on cassette may seem outdated, they shouldn't be automatically discarded if they're still being used. You might have, one or two patrons that really still need the cassette format. If you don't find that that's worth keeping around your cassette collection, you might want to move those, make sure those books are moved to CD, and then perhaps offer a CD player for your patrons to check out with your CD collection. Also, you want to look at how your tapes are. The magnetic tapes in cassettes, they don't last forever, right? So if the tapes are in poor condition, and they often are because they're fragile, it might be time to just remove them entirely. So understanding who uses the collection and what devices they rely on is really essential to understand before making weeding decisions. Downloadable audiobooks do represent the most current technology, but especially for our smaller and rural libraries, it's not always appropriate to weed a physical copy just because you have a digital version available. You need to look at what your patrons are still using. And then unlike print, audiobooks include a performative element, right? The narrator. So that added dimension can be a really compelling reason to retain an audio title, even if the print version has been weeded. So maybe the print version isn't circulating so well, but you have an audiobook by a certain narrator, you might want to consider keeping that. Some narrators like Barbara Rosenblatt, George Guidall, and Jim Dale have huge fan followings. I will listen to anything Jim Dale puts out, right? He narrated Harry Potter, the Harry Potter series, which was extremely popular. One person doing every, character in the book. It's just really well done. So these listeners, we have listeners that will seek out these narrators regardless of the author or the subject matter. Keeping that in mind can help you preserve valuable and high interest items within your audiobook collection, even if you're weeding the physical format. And then also nonfiction audiobooks, especially in areas like health, science, or technology, become outdated very quickly. Removing those older titles ensures that the library provides current and accurate information. So you'll want to take a look at your dated content and possibly weed that out or replace it with updated information. So helping a patron choose the right audiobook is essential to making sure that your patron has a positive listening experience, and it will encourage your listeners to continue engaging with audio formats. Unlike print books, audiobooks have that added layer of performance where the narrator's voice and pacing and tone significantly impact how the story is received. So we want to try and match up the right listener to the right audiobook so that we don't have frustrated or disinterested patrons. Let's talk about Reader's Advisory. So we want to make sure our patrons have the right format, and we're going to look at physical first. So these are non-streaming audiobooks. So that Library Journal survey saw that 99% of responding libraries had physical audiobooks for adults, 92% had physical audiobooks for children. 38% of libraries say that they have playaways for adults, 52% said they have playaways for children, and then CDs make up the majority of all physical media, even still today. So I like that other down there. That other was cassette tapes and other types of physical media. But as for borrowers, it's interesting to note that libraries say that 1/4 of their adult patrons use audiobooks exclusively, and 12% of their patrons use audiobooks exclusively. So that's very interesting, and it really highlights the need to make sure that audiobooks stay in our collection, because we have 25% of adults only using audiobooks. We also have the digital side, right? So digital options are increasingly being favored over physical media. Formats like playaways, Wonderbooks, and Voxbooks are gaining popularity, and traditional CDs are declining. So this shift that we're seeing is reflecting broader technological trends and changing listening habits among families. So digital audiobook circulation was 3 times higher than physical audiobook circulation, which makes sense because patrons checking out e-audiobooks don't have to come to the library to pick their books up. We are able to reach more people in rural areas. We're able to reach people who just can't drive, which is great. And that statistic makes sense, right? We see that adults are choosing digital audiobooks more than children, but adults also have fewer physical audiobook options. They don't have as many playaways and books that talk to them when they hit a button. Generally, they just get, CDs. So that makes sense too. All right, the right platform. So we have so many platforms to choose from. Overdrive is the dominant platform right now for downloadable audiobooks, and it is used by 90% of our public libraries. Many of our public libraries are relying on it exclusively because it has a huge selection. It's very easy to use. We also have platforms like One Click Digital and Hoopla. Roughly 1/3 of libraries use One Click Digital or Hoopla. 45% of libraries generally stick to just one service for their digital audio offerings, which makes sense because you don't want to overwhelm your patrons. So we have lots of options here. We have Access 360 from Baker and Taylor. We have Bibliotheca Cloud Library. We have EBSCO, Hoopla from Midwest, Overdrive by Overdrive, and then Recorded Books from RB Digital. And of course, Overdrive is king right now. So we have lots of platforms, and if you have patrons coming to you and your library offers these platforms, you should definitely be familiar with these platforms, no matter what platform it is. So you might have a patron come to you saying, I don't know how to use, EBSCO audiobooks. Well, if your library offers it, it's a good idea for you to be familiar with it. So let's look at the right sound. So we have 7 different things to look at. So narrator speed is our first. Some patrons like fast-paced delivery. I tend to talk very quickly. So some patrons might want to hear my fast-paced reading. But then we have other patrons who prefer slower narration, right? There's a lot of digital platforms that let users adjust the playback speed, but the natural rhythm of the narrator is still going to impact the tone and accessibility. So you'll want to keep track of which narrators speak quickly and which are more laid back. We have narrator accent and dialect. Some patrons like the authenticity and immersion that accents offer when listening to audiobooks, and some find unfamiliar speech patterns really difficult to follow. So my suggestion to librarians is to sample audiobooks beforehand, especially when it sounds like it might be a distinctive pronunciation or linguistic style that the narrator is going to use. With the narrator voice and tone, so some listeners prefer calm, soothing voices, and others gravitate toward dramatic, expressive performances. Matching the reader's vocal quality to the listener's taste is really important in Reader's Advisory. We have single versus full cast narration. We talked about that earlier. Some patrons prefer one narrator, while others prefer the theatrics of a full cast audio. So when you're doing reader's advisory, be sure to clarify which type of narration your patrons prefer when making recommendations. We have story pacing and genre fit. Some patrons prefer fast-paced genres like thrillers or action novels, and those translate really well to audio and they keep listeners engaged. But slower literary fiction or really dense texts can lose your listener's attention if not paired with a really strong narrator. So when recommending titles, consider how the book's genre and tempo are going to align with the patron's listening habits and attention span. We need to understand our patrons' comprehension needs. Some patrons look for audiobooks that offer clear speech and slow narration, which will support reading comprehension. Generally, our patrons who are learning English or might have reading or learning challenges prefer clear speech and slower narration. So recommending titles with well-articulated narrators and then also suggesting patrons follow along in print are really excellent strategies to improve comprehension. Or if you have a parent who's looking for an audiobook for their child, you might just want to recommend the print book at the same time and say, sometimes it's easier to understand the book when you're reading the print at the same time. And then mood and purpose. So understanding a patron's purpose for listening can really guide audiobook recommendations. If someone's looking to be entertained during a commute, like a drive into work, they might want a really gripping story. Whereas a patron who's looking to listen to audiobooks at bedtime or to relax might prefer something calm and with low intensity. Appeal factors, these appeal factors work just like print book, right? So one of the most challenging aspects of working with audiobook collections is learning what gives an audiobook its appeal and then using that to recommend titles to our listeners. So audiobooks aren't just about the content of the book, they're also about the experience of listening. And that depends heavily on the production elements. So we have tone, which is the first element that will capture your listener's attention, is the skilled narrator, whether they're creating an atmosphere that feels unsettling or humorous. So good narrators will amplify the print author's tone, and when they do that effectively, they create a book that will keep your listeners engaged. So in addition to voice work, narrators are responsible for managing the storyline, which can become really complex. So in that case, you might want to look at multiple narrators. If you have a patron who's looking for an engrossing story, you might want to look at multiple narrators. If you're looking for a patron who wants a live audience, you might want to look at something folksy. So just make sure that you're looking at the appeal factors when your patrons come in looking for their stories. So let's go over some challenges to Reader's Advisory. You've done everything right, but you're still not sure what to do about certain things. So unlike print books, you have the narrator, right? And a book that's really well liked can kind of fall flat if the narrator doesn't suit the listener's preference. So to overcome the narrator impact, you might want to look at audiobooks read in many different ways and by different narrators. That's going to give you a really good idea of what to recommend to a patron who thinks that a narrator sounds too nasally or has too strong of an accent. If a listener isn't enjoying the narrator, you'll want to make sure that you have other narrators to recommend to them. So one challenge might be limited availability. You might not have the audiobook available in the format that the patron needs, or you might have a licensing restriction. So to overcome that, try keeping a list of places that patrons can find audiobooks that appeal to them in all different places. Know how to use your own audiobook platforms and know what your library already offers. Discovery tools. Many library catalogs and book recommending platforms are actually not optimized for audiobook searches. Narrator filters, length of the audio, performance style. Often we don't have that metadata in our catalogs, and it makes it really hard to help patrons discover their different options. So to overcome that, I suggest keeping a list in your Reader's Advisory notebook of popular audiobooks based on narrator type or performance type that you can look to quickly, especially if you know that your LMS isn't really robust or the metadata isn't there. So listener preference. patrons have different listening needs, right? So some want fast, short titles for commuting. Others want long, immersive stories. You need to be able to match your listener needs with the different audiobooks. And again, I would keep a list in my reader's advisory notebook of audiobooks, and I would keep that list based on appeal factors, something that you can refer to quickly when a patron says, oh, I want, something relaxing. You can just look up real quick and see what you have. Lack of librarian experience. Some librarians feel less confident recommending audiobooks, especially if they don't listen to them themselves, which makes it really hard to do reader's advisory. And the only way to overcome that challenge is to start listening to audiobooks. So I suggest listening to audiobooks on your drive to and from work or while making dinner. And then technology barriers. This is for both our librarians and our patrons. Technology issues can really slow down or complicate things, especially to patrons or librarians new to digital formats. And the only way to overcome that is just to practice. So if you don't know how to use Libby or Hoopla or whatever your library offers, just jump on in and see what you can find. So we also have best of lists. So as a librarian, you might not be familiar with audiobooks, especially if you prefer to read physical. So here you'll see the best of list, and then the 2024 winner is the picture shown. So ALA Notable Children's Recordings is a list of titles for children up to age 14. It is announced during the ALSC's, during the Association for Library Service to Children week, and then on their website, and then during a press release. And this last year, Carter Avery's Tricky Fourth Grade Year One. We also have the ALA Amazing Audiobooks for Young Adults Best of lists. And then this year, Diet Soda Club one, I guess. This list is announced every January. We have RUSA's Listen List, which is an annual list of 12 outstanding audiobooks, which is announced at the Book and Media Awards held on the Sunday of each ALA Midwinter Conference. And then we have the Book List Editor's Choice Adult Audiobooks, and they publish this list, which has adult audiobooks on it alongside their print titles. All right, so let's look at promotion and marketing. So when you promote your audiobooks, it's a lot like promoting your physical books, right? You want to create eye-catching displays. You want your patrons to discover new titles. You want to highlight popular and new or themed titles, right? Audiobooks in blue to capture patrons' attention. You want to offer in-person recommendations. One thing you might be able to do is host a listening station where you have maybe a CD player and some audiobooks set up where patrons can sample the audiobook before checking it out, which is a good way to help patrons find new audiobooks that they might not have listened to otherwise. Some other examples are you might want to do a monthly audiobook club, which I found interesting. You might want to have an audiobook narrator come in and do a program. You might want to offer audiobooks during programming, like knitting or crochet groups. You can start a book club, like the Visually Limited Book Club. You can have launch parties for audiobooks, just like you might have a launch party for a physical book. Another thing to do is to market to your youth, right? You can engage parents. You can set up family-friendly displays for on-the-go listening. You can curate audiobooks for family events like road trips or summer vacations. Make sure to cater to the bored child, right? The child who has nothing to do. Well, go ahead and set up an audiobook collection as a display just for that. And then also, don't be afraid to use audiobooks in baby times or to have an audiobook running before a children's program. So when the kids are just running around playing and getting ready for story time, you could have an audiobook playing in the background. So don't be afraid to try that also. It might not work, but it might also promote your collection. And then also, you can consider allowing listening minutes to count for your summer reading minutes. And then focus your outreach on intervention specialists. If you're an outreach librarian, try and promote your audiobook collection to like the speech therapist, the reading interventionists at your schools when you go in to do your outreach. And then, of course, start a club, right? Kids and grown-ups love clubs. The Audiobook Listeners Club would be great for children and adults. All right, so let's wrap things up by looking at some resources and recommendations. And these resources and recommendations on this whole slide are available as a PDF along with the live links in the course shell. You can go ahead and just download this as a PDF and click on the links. So we have professional articles and guides. I've listed 3 here that you can read if you'd like on your own using the live links. The Art of Audiobook Narration is actually a YouTube video, and it's a behind the scenes look at narration, production, and what makes a compelling listen. And that's like an 8-minute video if you wanted to look at that. I've listed the awards and recommended lists. So if you're doing your collection, you're like, oh, what did she say about those awards? Here's 3 different awards that you can look at, or best of lists. We have some collection development tools. If you're trying to develop your collection as a librarian, you can take a look at these. And then I listed 2 books for professional development, The Art of Voice Acting and Reading with Your Ears. And both of these are helpful books that you can read if you're looking for professional development. And then lastly, we have a list here of free audiobooks. So obviously we want patrons to use the resources that we have at our libraries, but I know that some libraries are working on a very thin, fraying shoestring budget, right? But we still need to serve our patrons who both want and need audiobooks. So these are all different places that your patrons can go to find free audiobooks. So you might want to keep this in your reader's advisory notebook. You can just bring it up when if you know you don't have library books to offer, you can bring this up. If I were a librarian and I knew I didn't have library books in my library, I would go to these different websites so that I knew how to use them, so that when patrons came in needing audiobook options, you would know exactly how to help your patron. Now I'll let you look through those after the webinar, and there's all kinds of good things on here. Story Nories for children. We have Project Gutenberg, Light Up Your Brain, lots of things for kids and adults. The future of audiobooks is exploding. One thing I do want to point out especially is AI narration, because AI is also exploding. The School Library Journal and the Library Journal found that as a whole, patrons do not like computer narration and synthetic voices. Right now, as AI generated narration gets better, we might find that we can't even tell the difference between a human voice and an AI voice. But at the moment, reader preference is that they do not like AI narration. So if you get books in that are narrated by a computer, you might want to take a listen to it so you can at least recommend it appropriately to your patrons. As a whole, though, audiobooks are exploding. Streaming is reshaping access. More people are listening through mobile apps and streaming platforms like YouTube and Spotify. For libraries, you're going to need to look at important questions like licensing, access, discoverability. But this is good. Audiobooks exploding are good. It's just one more way to bring literacy and discovery to our patrons that might not otherwise find our books accessible. All right, well, that concludes our webinar training on everything you need to know about audiobooks. As a reminder, there are those downloadable PDFs of resources, anything I cited, all of the studies that I looked at, all of our links, those are on the PDF. If you have questions or comments, or you just want to discuss books, you can email me at sarah.patterson@ky.gov. If you have general questions on certification or audiobooks, you can email our shared email at kdla.certification@ky.gov.